Hi guys, this is the story of Lenny from Of Mice and Men. I want to educate you about him. Lenny was a little different than George on Of Mice and Men. Lenny seemed to get into trouble because he didn't know his own strength. And he was really a kind person, but he didn't know his own strength and how strong he was. So maybe, don't know why. They won't explain that part in the movie. Some people think that Lenny had what is called intellectual disability. We don't use the R word, because the R word's like a put down for people with disabilities. Um, Lenny liked to squeeze things too tight, and he didn't know how strong he was. And he didn't intentionally kill things, but he did. And that's why they didn't give him a mouse or a pet gerbil or that. Because, Lenny, he was kind of clumsy and he didn't know his own strength. Now, it wasn't intentional. He didn't mean to. No one ever explained why was Lenny so childlike, whereas George was more the sensible person, like trying to help Lenny. So, and there's other things about Lenny that I'm going to get into, which will be part two. But we'll get into details later. Lenny worked with George. He had to follow George. And George told him to go to a special place if he got into any trouble, because George didn't want to see him in trouble or put in jail or the cops shooting him or something like that. So I don't think that would go down well in Lenny's future. See, if it was now, Lenny probably would be having some support and some support not. I don't know. It's just, Lenny is a little different. Lenny is different. He didn't know how strong he was, and he got in trouble, and George had to help him so he would make the wise choices. But not always did Lenny make wise choices, and he had the mind of a child, which probably in a 10 or 11-year-old child is, he kind of talked kind of like a child would. So there's a few things about Lenny that I have to go over. We're going to get into the mystery of Mice and Men. And it was a book by John Steinbeck, if you read it. It's about a man named Lenny, and Curly was the bully in it. And then there was George, who was the sensible person. And then Curly's wife, which George didn't want Lenny near because that would cause trouble with Curly. And Curly wasn't a very nice person. He was more like a posse. So, yeah, we're going to get into that later. How can I explain Lenny? Lenny liked to touch things when he did. He didn't know how strong he was, and that sort of got him into trouble. He didn't know when to let go because he didn't know how he was strong. He didn't even understand about strength. People had to educate him, and he had to have George. So George and Lenny were friends. But it did educate people about friendship and how to respect your friends, and that we accept everyone as a divine being. That's what I want to call Lenny, a beautiful gift, a divine being. But Lenny wasn't very bright, and without George, Lenny would probably get in trouble. So, this is going to help you guys educate you about Of Mice and Men. This is a part 2 thing. So we're in part 1 right now. Another thing about Lenny is he and George traveled. And whenever Lenny would say something out of turn, George would tell him the story about tending the rabbits. See, George wanted to teach Lenny about responsibility a bit, but he would turn it around as tending rabbits, and that they would own a farm one day and they would get rabbits. So he can feed the rabbits and learn responsibility. That would probably help him with his strength. I don't know what would happen now if he was alive. So we're comparing Lenny to George. We'll get into that later. When Lenny saw a puppy, he wanted to have a puppy as a pet. He had to ask George for permission if he wanted a puppy, because he didn't know how strong he was. So he had to have George with him when he went to see Slim's puppies. And he really was desperate to have a puppy. It was like a kid when you see a puppy. You want to pet that puppy. You want to hold a puppy, right? But sometimes George had to talk to Lenny about not taking the puppy out the stall away from the mother when it was too young. Lenny didn't understand that. And that's why Lenny needed George to help him. Without George, he would be clueless. So let's talk about this. Another thing to describe Lenny as: a big, friendly giant. He was very strong, and he could do the job if George was there to help him. But he could probably do a job. He was pretty high functional, and nowadays if he lived, he could probably live on his own with a mild support, but he could live on his own if he was alive now. And think about it, that's so long ago. That was about the Great Depression in the 30s, so could you imagine living then? You couldn't wear pants. Boys had to have short hair and wear suits and that, so. And girls had to wear dresses back then. They were very strict. So, could you imagine living then? If you were a tomboy, you'd probably be allowed to get away with wearing a men's jacket and a hat. Or maybe men's buckle pants, and I don't know. Guess there were in those days, but it was most like, oh, girls had to wear dresses then. I don't know. They were very strict about fashion then. But Lenny, we're talking about Lenny. Lenny was different than George. Lenny liked his beans with ketchup. That was a good thing about Lenny, is the beans and the ketchup. Most people wouldn't care what they put on their ketchup. If they're in the woods, they have to eat to survive, right? So most people would put tomato sauce on their beans. Lenny wouldn't do that. He wanted ketchup on his beans. That's why it annoyed George, because he didn't have ketchup. He had to accept the beans he had. So Lenny was fussy about his beans. So that sort of indicated Lenny didn't accept change, because changing to another bean to Lenny would scare him. Another thing about Lenny is, on Of Mice and Men, you notice some things about Lenny that they didn't explain in the movie. Probably because they were trying to educate people. Lenny was kind of mind-boggled, where George was kind of like, avoid people you don't like and not have anything to do with them. Where Lenny would talk to people he didn't like. He was a total opposite of George. That's why George had to tell him to stay away from Curly's wife, because she would get him into trouble. And that would get George lecturing Lenny. And Lenny wouldn't want that, would he? This is an education, folks, on how people are different than one another, because people don't understand the difference between people who have what is called a disability and people who are hearing impaired and other people. Some people don't just understand these kind of things, so we got to educate. So that's why Lenny is my test subject. So Lenny would be a great example of difference between the two. There was a little difference between George. He was more sensible and he would eat beans that were given to him. Now, Lenny would only eat beans if they had ketchup, and he would threaten to run away if he didn't have his ketchup. And that would upset Lenny because he didn't accept change. So I guess running away is a way of saying, I don't want change. The thought of not having beans and ketchup would terrify Lenny. But if you were someone else and you were just your regular guy, like someone who understands, wouldn't really get upset about not having beans and ketchup. Now, there were some childish ways Lenny was kind of like a child in a big man's body, but in a way he was still a child. And there were some ways you could tell he was very childlike in his manner to society, that he would only accept beans and ketchup. If someone offered him a plate of cookies, they weren't beans and ketchup. That would frighten Lenny, right? I don't know. Nowadays, he probably learned to accept it. Another thing about Lenny is he liked puppies or wanted to touch things and didn't stop because he didn't know how to pet things properly and he didn't know his own strength and that he would crush things, but not intentionally. He didn't know when to stop that petting. You pet gently and you pet a puppy gently and you have to be gentle. You don't break their bones because they're fragile. Lenny wouldn't understand that. See, if he was around now, he would pick up a puppy, but he wouldn't know how to hold it, and he would need George to tell him, you don't do that to a puppy. He had to learn that his strength could actually harm people, but not intentionally, because he didn't understand about his strength. There were ways that George wanted to teach Lenny about society and his strength and how people can take the wrong meaning of them and how people can make it into something that is not. Another thing about Lenny is Lenny liked to get upset about little things. He was kind of, you could tell, he would talk about tending the rabbits in the farm because someone else would want that, and he would talk about how important George is to him because George was his friend. And he wouldn't have so much to say because Lenny didn't say too much. He was kind of a shy guy and very tall and very strong. That's why they hired him on the farm. You need to be very strong. I don't know if Lenny could make it as a firefighter. I don't know about strength there. Lenny didn't know his own strength, but if George was there to teach him the ropes, he probably would manage. Or maybe mess it up. Unless there was a Curly on the team. I don't know. And then there were other things about Lenny that the movie didn't properly explain. That Lenny was very set in his ways, like wanted everything a certain way. He wouldn't accept change because of the idea when George said we didn't have beans and ketchup, but he said I wanted ketchup and beans, but he said you had to accept the beans that we have. Now that's hard on Lenny. Lenny wouldn't. If he went to a party they didn't have beans and ketchup, he might threaten to run away or pet a mouse when George told him not to pet a mouse because he would squeeze it, but not on purpose. So another thing about Lenny is Lenny tended to wander and he would go places that he wasn't allowed, or he'd go near people even if he didn't get along with them because he wanted to be too friendly. So some ways Lenny was a bit too friendly, but with George taught him to avoid certain people, that George would tell Lenny They have to avoid certain people. Certain people are to be avoided at all times. So, yes, that's the thing about Lenny that people needed to know. Okay. Of Mice and Men was a great story. It was John Steinbeck. The characters are Slim, Candy, I think Curly, Curly's wife, I forget her name, and another guy. Slim was the one who had the puppies that Lenny took an interest in. And then there was Candy, who was an older man in the barn who had a dog who was dying because his dog was deaf and not able to see, so they had to shoot the dog. And that didn't go down well with Candy because it also talked a lot about putting a dog down out of a misery when it's in pain. And the movie also topic those kind of subjects, so that would kind of upset people because of the idea of losing your best friend. Because in a way, a dog is kind of close to you. You sort of share a bond with the dog. You communicate with the dog. You're attached to that dog. And then it gets old. That's kind of hard on a person. Another social issue in Of Mice and Men was intellectual disability, which is a long time ago called mental retardation, but we use the word intellectual disability or mentally challenged. But we don't even use that word because it can be insulting, so intellectual disability was a way to describe Lenny. Lenny was a special kind of human. He was caring, but not knowing his own strengths, so in a way he'd get in trouble. But maybe you got too friendly, so sometimes being too friendly isn't always a good idea because it can get you into trouble. Lenny didn't know about people's privacy, like space. Space would be hard on Lenny. Another thing about people who have autism or intellectual disability, another trait is repetitive behavior. Lenny did had some repetitive behavior about puppies and his strength, about beans and ketchup. That would probably bother Lenny if you told him there's no beans and ketchup because he wouldn't understand that you can't always get beans and ketchup. So another social issue described in that movie is about bullying, which was Curly, but it also featured bullying as a topic in the movie that people missed in the movie, and it was too close to home to me because I feel bullied and I get depressed, and it's gotten to the point where I don't feel I'm accepted in society. But that's just my feelings, and I get bullied to the point I don't want to be around people because I feel people use me or bully me, and it hurts me. And that subject was also topicked on Of Mice and Men. Another topic that they mentioned was how George and Lenny got along and the difference between the two. That George wasn't very bright, where he had to. George was the brightest, and Lenny was kind of not very bright because he wouldn't understand that no means no and to avoid people that shouldn't be around him. And Lenny always hung out with people because he was very kind and generous, but maybe too kind. Another social issue in that movie is about loneliness. That's why Curly's wife hung around the barn because she was lonely and her husband wasn't giving her the attention she wanted. And that makes a woman lonely, and women are more prone to be lonely. Another issue in that movie is domestic violence, because Curly was very abusive to his wife, the way he treated her, and saving a boxing glove to hit his wife. So, in a way, it topic domestic violence. And that's a very serious issue, and we're going to get into that in part two. The next serious issue in that is acceptance, how to behave in a certain community. The community guidelines was another issue topicked on it, but we don't topic that very much because the movie didn't really describe too much. So there were topics that I have to say that took an interest to me. Another subject in that movie was how the people reacted to Lenny being in the barn. Some people were okay, except Curly, but Curly was a bully. But how did Lenny react? By crushing Curly's hand and broke it. Usually in society, crushing a hand may get you in trouble by police nowadays. But Lenny did that because Curly was kind of antagonizing him to fight and encouraging him to punch him. So he had to do what was best for him in order to survive Curly, because Curly was a mean, cold-hearted human being. And that's what I meant. The topic had a lot about bullying. See, George wanted Lenny to stand up for himself, and that's why he crushed his hand. But he was told by Slim that he got his hand caught in the machine and wouldn't mention about it. But then there was an issue. So another topic in that movie is about how Lenny behaved in society. The scene where he's in the barn and he's stroking Curly's wife's hair and she didn't like it, and then he accidentally squeezed her so hard he broke the neck. Now in society, if he was around nowadays, people get punished for those kind of things. So in a way, if Lenny was alive, police would probably be talking to him and he wouldn't like it. So there are a few social issues topicked in Of Mice and Men. And if you want to know about Of Mice and Men, you can read the book. I'm going to post the description down below about Of Mice and Men. I'm going to do a Storyfire series on Of Mice and Men eventually. I think that will come out pretty soon. So take care, folks, and have a nice summer.